everyone, welcome back to Strip by Sia, your podcast for strippers, sex workers, and all the fancy naked people in between. I am your host, Steph Sia, formerly known as Kimchi on the stage, digital content creator, all around a weird person. I like to talk, and this is why I have a podcast, but I am not very good at speaking about myself, so that's why I have a guest on every single week, and we pretty much dive into all aspects of sex work. And this week, I'm so excited to finally get this person onto the show. I invited fellow dancer Lynx Chase onto the show today to speak about her Indigenous background, how that affects her sexuality, her sex work, kink, responsible dom, everything. Like, there's so much to unpack here, really. I don't even really know where to get started, but Lynx, are you there?
I am here, yes.
Yay.
Here and happy to be here.
Yay. I've been chasing you for so long.
Yes. You've been chasing Lynx Chase.
Oh my God, I didn't even realize I did that. That was great. That was perfect. I am very, very thrilled to have you on. As I said, I have been trying to get you on since season 1, but you know what? You're finally here. We've made it. We're in the midst of a pandemic. We're gonna shoot the shit and talk about all of the things today. I feel like I butchered your intro. Do you want to give yourself a better intro in terms of who you are, what you do, in your own words and on your own terms?
Sure, yeah. Well, my name is Lynx Chase. I've been a stripper for about 8 years now, and within those 8 years have dabbled into other forms of sex work, like being a dominatrix. That's been more of a side gig for me. It's not stripping was definitely more of a full-time thing for me. I'm also a burlesque dancer. I started off in performance arts, primarily doing aerial arts. So I would be, contracted at different festivals to perform, either doing aerial hoop or dance and other things. But I kind of started getting into burlesque more after stripping, which is kind of the other way, because I know a fair bit of burlesque dancers that have gotten into working and dancing in clubs, but only after doing burlesque. So I'm kind of the other way around. I am a mixed ancestry, Lithuanian, French, and Cree Metis. Wow. I'm born and raised in Montreal, and also an OnlyFans content creator, and I'm kinky as fuck.
We like kinky people. This is why you're here.
Yes.
We're going to speak about all the kinks. That's totally okay. Safe space.
No shame.
Well, that's a lot there. So, oh gosh, I don't even know where to start. Did you want to start in terms of your roots in Montreal, how you got started with stripping, what led you to that? And yeah,
definitely.
It's a good story.
So like I said, I'm born and raised in Montreal. I've always felt since I was really young, I've always felt a deep fascination for sexiness and sexuality and just everything that falls under that umbrella term, I guess. And
right.
Yeah, I remember seeing, one example that seeing the Chicago movie or any kind of burlesque movies and seeing the showgirls and all their big fancy costumes.
Yes.
And I remember when I was a kid, I was like, I want to do that. When I grew up, that's the shit I want to get into. And I didn't really know how I would get into it, but I knew I had this deep sense of yearning to get into that world of being a fancy naked lady.
Yeah.
So I got into stripping and sex work pretty much when I was 18 or 19.
Okay.
Actually, no, I was 19. I was bartending when I was 18.
Wait a minute.
And this is back in when Backpage was still a thing.
Yes, when that was still around.
Rest in peace.
I know.
And Craigslist too.
Yes.
Whatever the name of that category on
classifieds?
Craigslist that they had the
sex worker ads.
Yeah, and they like removed it right when FOSTA and SESTA came to legislature in the States, and that affected. Yeah, that's a whole other conversation in itself.
It is a huge conversation.
I will not open that can of worms right now. But yeah, so I was always, I guess I started off doing like modeling and nude modeling. So I would either model for some of my friends who had clothing companies. And then I started doing live drawing modeling. So I would respond to ads for art school where they would need me to, go into their class for 2 hours and do a pose, hold it for 10 minutes and be there for like 2-3 hours. And so I was always comfortable. Like nudity was not ever like really a big deal to me. I was always comfortable with it. And so that kind of led me into, exploring some more like sex worky type things. Mm-hmm. So the first thing I ever did that I guess falls under the category of sex work, which I mean, I'm sure you've probably like mentioned this before, but I'm just gonna, clarify that again. But there is like a misunderstanding that a lot of people think that sex work means by definition, like having sexual intercourse, and while it does mean that for a lot of people and a lot of folks who work in the industry, to me when I look at sex work, I see it as an umbrella term for any kind of profession that involves the exchange of sexual services of any kind, whether it be offering companionship, stripping, topless waitressing, or maybe not topless waitressing, but like being a dom, like doing full service and so all of that. So when I say, sex work, I, that's kind of, like,
no, that's great. And I'm glad you define it too, because every now and then we do need a refresher, and there are a lot of civilians that listen on the show as well. So it's totally good to have that there. So thank you for that.
Yeah, for sure. So like I had done like random nude modeling gigs and stuff, and then there was a friend of mine who, we had talked about those kinds of like weird Craigslist gigs that we were doing. And she had scored one, which was for a topless poker dealing for a bachelor party. And she for some reason wasn't able to make it. And so she passed it on to me.
Oh, nice.
And I went to this gig, and I kind of was like, okay, whatever. I guess I'm like going to deal some poker without a top on. That's fine with me. And we ended up, the other girl that I went with, I don't even remember who she was, but we did like, a strip show, and they did lap dances and stuff. So that was kind of like my first time stripping.
Wow.
Yeah. So it was like at a private party, and it was great. I had a fun time. The guys were nice, and they paid us, and we had a fun time. And then, from that moment on, I started meeting more people who were doing that kind of work, which eventually led me to meeting dancers who were working in clubs.
Right.
And then the first club I worked in actually was in Prince George. It was Alibis.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Okay, long time ago.
Yeah, so this was a long time ago. And when I was at Alibis, I wish I remembered the dancer's name. I would love to give her a shout out right now, but she had like really hooked me up with all the like phone numbers for the agents, and basically gave me all the resources I needed to keep working on stage, because I really loved, I've always loved performing. I've always loved being an entertainer and being on stage. So doing that over doing like, private I mean, I don't mind doing private parties. It can definitely be fun, but I do prefer working on a stage as much as possible. So
having that
my gateway.
Performative aspect is so, how do you say it? Just there's just like something about it being on stage, right? It's so
totally. And like I'm definitely an exhibitionist, and I love to be watched. So that really kind of adds to it.
It goes hand in hand, so it's kind of perfect.
Totally.
Okay, so that's how you got started with stripping, and then how did you? Because you said you fell into burlesque afterwards, which I mean, I don't hear that kind of journey into it very often. Usually, as you said, it's like the other way around.
Totally.
So
Yeah.
what happened there? How did you get involved?
So when I first got settled into Vancouver, one of my good friends, I guess at the time, her and I had just met, and I met because, the guy that I was dating at the time, I had, gone, like, he was staying at some person's house, and I went over to meet him after, and this was after I was working a shift at the Number 5 Orange, and I went over to who was my boyfriend at the time, to the place that he was staying at, to hang out after work, and there was this woman who's Crystal Precious, and she's she's a prominent burlesque figure. She's amazing. I love her so much. And so that was when I first met her, and like I wasn't like totally out about being a stripper with everyone. Like my close friends knew, but it was still like, I didn't, it was never something that I was like, oh my God, I have to like hide this or whatever. Like I never really understood the whole stigma around it. It was just kind of like a no-brainer for me.
Yeah.
But I was also, after, being a dancer for like almost a year, I started realizing like, oh, right, like, yeah, there's totally a lot of people that have a fucking stick up their ass about this that are going to be judgmental.
Yeah.
And so I got to be like, diligent just for my own safety about who I open up to about this, just like for the sake of self-preservation.
Yeah.
And so, when I met Crystal, she was I can tell she kind of gave me this look of like, oh, you're like, you're wearing like full face makeup. You look so glamorous. Like, what are you? Like, what are you doing? And like, I don't even know if I told her that I was a stripper that night, but she totally knew. And like, she ended up telling me this afterwards. But yeah, so like I was doing dance and stuff at the time, so she put me on to doing like backup dancing for her at some of her gigs.
Yeah.
At like Base Coast Festival and at some shows around the city too. So that was definitely like a part of my entry into performance arts. And
that's
this
awesome.
Reason, or I guess that's like one of the ways that I got to connect with a lot of people in the burlesque community in Vancouver.
Yeah.
As well as, Nikki Nine Doors too, which, as we know, like, her and I worked at the Grand Bull Strip for, oh my gosh, like almost 4 years together. And I had known about her through the burlesque community.
Yeah.
But it wasn't until I think I had been working at the Strip for maybe close to a year, maybe a bit less than that, when she came in. And we were in that, tiny ass change room. You've probably gone up there before, but it was a really, really small change room. And we spent, like 3.5 years working in that club together. So we got... Yeah, I love Nikki a lot. She's definitely one of the dearest people in that industry to me. And it's cool to have someone who's also on both sides of burlesque and stripping.
And stripping too.
Exactly. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I've been meaning to get her on the show too. So like, oh my God. Yeah. So many good people. Be a great guest. So that's like your foray into the burlesque scene. Was it difficult for you at all in terms of, I guess, switching the gears a little bit? Because burlesque is a little bit different than stripping on stage or in the clubs. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like I see it as, burlesque and stripping are two branches from the same tree. Mm-hmm. Like back in the day, and this is a thing like I'll recommend for anyone listening, especially if you're based in Vancouver, and even if you're not based in Vancouver, just because this is a really important piece of work, but it's the book called History of Burlesque. It covers the history, obviously, of burlesque and showgirls in post-war Vancouver.
Oh, wow, that's really interesting.
It talks like, you'll get to learn about all the clubs that existed in Vancouver that have been shut down over the years. And the takes in that book are really interesting because the author talks about how the role that stripping and burlesque played in feminism. Okay. Which I think is something that's really important to talk about, especially when it comes to like women's rights and sexual autonomy, bodily liberation and all that. Like those are all things that we owe to a lot of like strippers and burlesque dancers, and we don't get that recognition from people, especially in like third wave feminism.
Right.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
So yeah, I guess like switching gears, I don't know, like So when Crystal would put me on to her shows, I wasn't performing a lot back in those days. I was definitely more interested in focusing on just working at the club and doing that.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
But yeah, like I guess the main thing for me in the difference is that, you know, you get naked faster and you don't take your panties off. But I mean, there's obviously so much more to it than that. Like, there's a whole aspect of, you know, when you're working at the club, you're working the floor and you're talking about all these interactions that you have with, like, customers, which is not something that happens in burlesque at all.
No.
But yeah, like, I don't know, yeah, I guess kind of tracing back to what I said about burlesque and stripping being two branches from the same tree is that one of the things that that author, I wish I could remember her name off the top of my head right now.
I'm like trying to Google it right now.
But the woman who wrote the history of burlesque is how, you know, burlesque and modern stripping, the way we see it today, if you kind of, like I said, like two branches from the same tree, if you go back, the moment where it kind of started splitting was when electronic music started becoming more of a thing, because back in the day it was all live bands that would play for the dancers. True. So yeah, like when that, I guess, started happening, I guess there was like a little bit of a divide, and there's so much more to it. Like I said, I really just would like to recommend people to read that book. It's really incredible, and you'll learn so much in it.
I'm trying to find it. Like, there's too many. Like, I wrote the history of burlesque book, and now I think all of these things are coming up that are, like, not the right book. I'm like, damn it!
Yeah, it's, the last name, I'm pretty sure her last name is Ross. It's like Diane, not Diane.
I'm like, Diane Ross?
No.
That would be amazing.
Picture later.
Oh, wait, I think I found it. Is it called, wait, no, maybe not. It's not Burlesque West.
Oh my god.
It
is Burlesque West.
Oh, shit.
Like such a dork.
Becky L. Ross.
Yes. Oh my gosh. I don't know why I completely like fucked up the name.
No, you're good.
Burlesque West. You know why I said the history of burlesque is because I recently made a post on my Instagram about the show that I did with Crystal Precious, actually, that was called The History of Burlesque.
There we go.
And I'm pretty sure I referenced the book in there at some point, but oh my gosh, I can't believe I just spent the last 5 minutes like referencing that book by a completely different title. My bad.
That is okay.
Becky L. Ross, if you're listening to this right now, I apologize.
Becky L. Ross, Burlesque West, Showgirls, Sex, and Sin and Postwar Vancouver, in case you guys are wondering. I'll post in the show notes at the at the end.
It's funny because the irony is like I just found my book in my house right now, and right as we finally discovered that I completely fucked up the title.
But of course.
Yeah.
That's okay.
Yeah. Whoops.
That's really cool, though.
Brain.
No, and it's been a long day today, too, so don't even worry about it.
Yeah, totally.
So that's really cool, though, in terms of, like, your foray into it, and then also your involvement with the burlesque community. I also want to kind of pivot and talk to you about the kink community, because obviously you've dabbled in quite a bit in terms of kink and fetish. How did you get involved with that side?
Well, okay, so I guess how did I discover that I was into kink and how that, okay, so let's backtrack.
Rewind.
It's always like a thing that I kind of joke about, but I think one of the things that, I mean, pretty much as soon as I started being sexually active, I always had like an inclination towards like kinky shit.
Okay.
And, you know, I was talking about this with a friend of mine the other day, and about like, okay, what were moments in your childhood that like impacted like your current sex life? And it's like I really want to try and be careful how we talk about this, because it's not like, you know, I'm not trying to say like I was doing all these things when I was a kid, but like
no.
those do impact how your life is gonna kind of flourish later on.
Of course.
And so one of those moments for me, so first of all, Aladdin was one of my favorite movies when I was a kid.
Okay.
And the scene in particular that I'm referencing is Slave Jasmine. So when Jafar, and she's wearing that sexy red outfit.
Yes.
And she's like, you know, handcuffed and everything, or I don't know if she was handcuffed.
I think she was. I think she was handcuffed.
And she, like, you know, walks up to him and she looks at him and she's like, and your beard is so twisted. But that moment, I felt something. Like, I remember looking at Jasmine, I was like, first of all, Jasmine, you look fine as hell. Like, that was definitely one of my, like, bisexual queer awakenings for sure.
Yes.
But also, like, the whole scene of, like, you know, like, I had a crush on Slave Jasmine. I also had a crush on Jafar. So, like, the whole, like, kind of villain, like, bad guy, like, who's holding you captive.
Yeah.
Archetype was something that definitely, like, plays into, or I guess that informed how I, like, I guess, explore my own kinks.
Interesting.
Yeah. So
wow.
that, I guess, like, you know, tracing way back. So let's kind of come back into my adult life.
Fast forward.
Yeah, so I guess, like, yeah, this was definitely always something that I was interested in.
Mm-hmm.
Throughout most of my relationships, actually pretty much throughout every relationship, now that I think of it, and sexual encounters too, that I've had, like, I was pretty much always the one who was kind of trying to get my partners to be like, hey, like, you should try tying me up, or like, I have these handcuffs, or I have this collar and a leash, and you should play with it. And it's like, you know, that gets, as much as a lot of the partners that I've had, you know, over the years have expressed being open to doing that, like, mm-hmm. there's been many times where they weren't always initiating that, which, especially as someone who, you know, I'm a switch, like, I can top, I can bottom, I can, you know, pancake ain't done until it's flipped on both sides. But I definitely prefer in my personal life, for the most part, being more a submissive.
Okay.
And so it's like, it gets kind of exhausting, I guess, to always be the one who's trying to initiate, because it, like, sort of goes against, like, the dynamic that I'm, you know, not to say that, like, submissives never initiate, because we do have to have those conversations with each other, especially if we're talking about kink, so we can, you know, go over boundaries, safe words, consent, and all that. But yeah, like, I don't know, I've often, to be honest, shied away from a lot of the parties in the scene, like, specifically in Vancouver, because
it's a small community here.
It's very, like, there's not a lot of diversity and representation in the scene, in my experience, and like, you know, especially since I've, you know, spent a lot more time and put a lot more effort into, you know, reconnecting with my Indigenous roots in the last few years. I've kind of, you know, the more I dive into, like, how politicized my existence is, the more I realize that, you know, being someone who enjoys being in a submissive role, I don't really want to do that with, like, white folks for the most part, you know, and I'm not saying, like, I'm never gonna, you know, bottom for a white man, but I probably won't. But, like, the thing is that, you know, if I met, you know, I always tell myself, if I meet someone and there's, like, good vibes and I feel safe and I feel seen, and I you know for sure that they're aware of the power dynamics at play and the politics that come into that, then, you know, I wouldn't deprive myself of pleasure. But unfortunately, this is definitely something that's pretty rare for a lot of white folks. Like, you know, I generally stay more open to, like, women, but in generally white men, like, I'm very, very hesitant towards, you know, putting myself in such a vulnerable position.
Of course.
Because I'm, like, afraid that that's going to trigger some of my own intergenerational trauma, you know, and, like, not to kink shame anyone, but there's, like, something that I noticed, which is, like, a theme that happens, you know, within the kink community. And, like, I mean, to anyone listening who's into kink, like, I mean no disrespect if this is your thing, but, like, the kind of religious kink, so, like, you know, women dressing up as nuns or as a priest, like, that is, like, very triggering for me, especially because, you know, like, my grandfather and my great-grandmother were both residential school survivors.
Oh, my gosh.
I, you know, knowing, like, I just have, like, the association that I have with the Catholic Church is very trauma-centered, and so, you know, maybe for some people that could be a way for them to, like, reframe that into a positive experience, but I just don't like that. It's
totally.
Like, that's a hard limit for me. And like, yeah, I don't know. Not to say that that's the only reason why I've shied away, but it is definitely part of one of the reasons. But yeah, I guess like since I started feeling a little more distanced from, I guess, the scene and feeling very hesitant to getting involved in it, like a lot of my explorations and my education and the knowledge that I have within Kink was done primarily through research, like on my own, and only in the last like couple years have I started really, finding like other BIPOC folks. And so for anyone listening, if you're not familiar with the term BIPOC, it's an acronym for Black, Indigenous, and People of Color.
Thank you for the reminder.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, like I started like seeing, okay, like there's other BIPOC kinksters out there.
Yes.
That's super cool. And, some of the people, or I guess like there's this one power couple in particular that they have a porn company, or I guess like a film company called Royal Fetish Films.
Okay.
Their names are King Noir and Jet Setting Jasmine, and they're both Black performers and are doing, I mean, I love like their porn and everything that comes, everything that they've produced, whether it be films or their podcasts, and the content that they create is just, it's really amazing. And they also talk a lot about, they get involved very politically as well, like in the porn industry, and how
cool.
there's, there's a racism problem in the porn industry.
Yes,
and
there is.
It's cool to see other, performers and people who are in the scene that are aware of that and who are really kind of basically dedicating their lives to carving out safe spaces. They work with a lot of Black folks, but, for just BIPOC people in general, I guess, I think it's really affirming to be seeing other people out there who are kind of pushing to change the narrative and make sure that, BIPOC people can have safe spaces to be their best freaky selves without feeling uncomfortable because of the racial power dynamics that might be at play.
Yeah, no, totally. I hear that. And I've just given them a follow too. So I'm like, oh, this is interesting.
Yeah.
This is so
cool. Totally. They're really, I mean, they're like beautiful, like physically, like incredibly attractive people, but they're also like, I just love their work, and they're both very, I look up to them a lot.
Really cool. I'm going to have to, I'm like trying to follow all their accounts right now.
Yeah, totally.
Another resource, right? So if there's an opportunity where I can learn or my listeners can learn, then I'm going to take advantage of it. So
for sure, yeah.
But I wanted us to pivot the conversation in terms of you identifying as Indigenous. So, because you mentioned some things back there too. You mentioned residential schools, which is a term that, a lot of Canadians be very familiar with. In terms of like our history here. So, but we do have a lot of listeners from the States and also other parts of the world as well. Do you mind kind of going into what that means, what that entails, and what that means for the Indigenous people?
For sure. So for anyone who might be from the States, the equivalent of what happened in the States was the boarding schools. And essentially what happened is that the government, there were RCMP officers that would come into the homes of Indigenous people and would steal their children away and send them into Catholic schools away, like far away from their families. And their whole mission, and this is like something that was literally written into legal documents, and the Indian Act was kill the Indian, save the man. And so the goal was basically to completely, disconnect us from our language, our culture, our traditional ways, and to assimilate us into like Catholic white-centric culture. So, there's been a lot of really horrific things that, I mean, first of all, like snatching the children out of someone's home is like a fucked up thing to do in the first place. But,
exactly.
There's a lot of children died in those schools. A lot of them did not get properly documented. And so even the numbers, if you go and try to learn a little bit more about the history of residential schools, some of the numbers that you might find online might not truly reflect like the actual amount of people that died within those institutions. And so you know, they would do things like they would, you know, cut our hair, which is like such an important part of who we are as Indigenous people. Like our, you know, that I don't want to like homogenize us as Indigenous folks, because, you know, every nation has their own teachings, and so I can't speak, you know, for all Indigenous folks, but this is definitely a thing that is common for a lot of us, is that, you know, our hair, and what I've learned is that, you know, our hair connects us to our ancestors and to our culture, and so that's why a lot of Indigenous folks don't, you know, have long hair, and so getting your hair cut is like a really, you know, for me and some of the teachings that I carry, like, you don't cut your hair unless, like, you're grieving and, like, you know, someone really important to you passes away.
Interesting.
And so, like, you know, being sent into these schools and having your hair cut off is a really, really traumatizing thing to go through.
Absolutely.
And, you know, we would get, you know, there was physical sexual abuse that would happen if we were caught, you know, trying to speak our language or practice our culture. And so that, like, the impacts that left onto our families is still felt today.
Yes.
And, you know, a lot of people think that this is a thing of the past, but
it's not.
The last residential school closed in 1996.
What?
I was alive when this was still happening. And so there's still a lot of, you know, residential school survivors that are alive today. And, you know, even though I haven't experienced that personally, and it's more removed for me because my grandfather passed away when my mom was 8. So that my relationship to my indigeneity is very complicated. I didn't really, I always knew, like, I was Indigenous on my mom's side, but I never knew much about, like, my family history. It wasn't until later on in my adult life that I started really pushing to learn more and trying to find out, you know, where my people are from and what's the history and all that.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, like, you know, but like we still feel that intergenerational trauma, like that presents itself in a lot of different ways for us. So yeah, that kind of, you know, there's a lot more. There's definitely a lot. I would recommend, like, especially if, you know, you're not non-Indigenous to Canada or North America, that I think it's really necessary for everyone to read into that history because they don't teach that in schools.
They do not
at all. You know, they have the classic, like, oh yeah, the boats came in and we had a nice dinner and it was great and we signed the treaties and the end, and it's like no, like, we're still getting our lands taken from us at gunpoint.
Yes.
And the relationship that the colonial state known as Canada has with Indigenous people is still really, really toxic and abusive. So and
I feel like they've just put a Band-Aid on things. Totally. And there are a lot of resources, and I'm sure we can plug some at the end of the show as well, but I just started taking a course in Indigenous studies in Canada. There was, like, a free one.
Nice.
Yeah, there's a free course on Coursera.
I know the one you're talking about.
Yeah, I was like, oh, what's this? I'm like, okay, it's free. New pandemic learning. So, and just trying to do my part in being responsible and just trying to educate myself.
Yeah, that's
like,
so good.
It's free. So I was like, well, I'll take free knowledge. So
yeah, totally.
But yeah, so there's so much there. I don't even know where to begin on this topic because, like, obviously your culture is a huge part of you. Like, for myself, I'm Filipino. I was born here. I'm Filipino Chinese, and I feel like I went through a lot of, like, different identities growing up. You know,
for sure.
And that's normal. That's normal. But, like, you know, back then for me, it wasn't cool to show my Asianness. It was like cool to be white, or all the cool kids were white. And then I went through, like, an Asian phase where I wanted to be Vietnamese and I wanted to be Chinese and I wanted to be Japanese, but I wasn't proud of who I was. So
yeah, totally.
It's only
I feel that too.
Yeah.
You know, kind of tracing back to, like, my mom, you know, growing up, like, she's French and Indigenous. So, you know, she grew up in a small town in northern Quebec, and, you know, it was very racist, and a lot of people, you know, we have to understand from that generation, because, you know, the people were still getting taken out of their homes for residential school. A lot of people lied about their identity as a way to protect themselves and their children.
Oh.
And would either say that they're, like, non-Indigenous completely, or they would say that they're, like, half. And, like, you know, and so that was the thing that a lot of people did to keep themselves
safe.
And
Yeah.
so talking about, you know, being Indigenous and whatnot, like that was not something that was cool at all for my mom when she was growing up. And so it was very much like, yeah, like we're kind of following a white-centric, Eurocentric, like Catholic way of living. And so, you know, that I felt that like growing up, like even though my mom always knew about it, it's just not something that was encouraged. And so I feel like I've definitely been like one of the main person in my family who's been really pushing to re-strengthen that. And you know, my mom, it's been nice. Like she's been supportive of it and has been definitely open to learning by my side and whatnot. So that's been like a cool way for us to connect.
Yeah. Where did that push come from? What motivated you to kind of dig deeper within your heritage?
Well, I always wanted, like, when I was a kid, growing up, I would always ask my mom questions, like, Mom, like, what about our Cree Métis side? Like, where are we from? Like, do you know anything about, you know, our history? And it was always like, no, like, you know, the stories and stuff that she would have are very limited. Like, you know, even my uncle would sometimes tell me about, you know, stories of their grandma, so my great-grandma, you know, picking medicines and making salves and making, you know, all these kind of potions and using plants a lot and like very much being into, you know, having some like land-based knowledge, which was cool, but like, you know, that's still very little compared to all the things that there are to know. So I guess, like one of the things that really pushed me was, you know, living in Vancouver and seeing, you know, or even just like looking at, for example, climate change and how a lot, you know, of the big grassroots movements that are responsible for, you know, creating like lasting changes and resistance against colonialism are led by Indigenous folk. And so, for example, in Vancouver, one of the main battles that I've seen going on over the years has been against the Kinder Morgan pipeline.
Yes, I was just going to say.
On Burnaby Mountain. And so seeing how, you know, these marches and everything and were always led by Indigenous folks, that made me really want to learn more about, you know, my own my own heritage. So I had a friend of mine who brought me to my first ceremony here in Vancouver, and you know, Vancouver is such a melting pot of culture, Indigenous people from all over. You know, there's people from the plains, there's people from the prairies, there's obviously, you know, Coast Salish people, Musqueam, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh. Like there's really people from all over. And so the ceremony that she had brought me to was on Tsleil-Waututh Reservation, and they, you know, the man who was leading it was Tsleil-Waututh and Squamish, I believe, but you know, there was people from all different nations there. So that's like what really kind of started solidifying me, kind of, I guess, like, going to ceremony and being around other people and understanding that, like, that sense of like disconnection and displacement that I feel is a very common thing that a lot of folks feel. So that kind of snowballed into me connecting with other Indigenous folks and just like strengthening that relationship that I have to myself. So it's been a very like complicated journey. There's lots of ups and downs. I'm questioning myself pretty much every single day on like what's the best way that I can go about this as like a mixed race, white passing, you know, those are all things that are really important to take into consideration that, you know, I can only speak from a limited experience. Like, I don't, you know, experience racism in the way that like visibly Indigenous people do. And like, you know, my family has felt it on different levels, but to understand that, like, you know, there are certain times where like I just pass the mic to people who have more lived experience than I do on certain topics.
Wow. Oh my gosh, there's so much there. so much there. Oh my gosh. I wanted to ask you, how does being Indigenous affect sex work and your sexuality?
Well, I mean, I guess, since I started really reconnecting with myself through ceremony, one of the main things that I had kind of noticed was this sense of like shame around sexuality. And this is like a complicated conversation, because I have to understand my privilege here as, you know, someone who, like, I'm a descendant of residential school survivors, but, you know, the experience of someone who lived through that directly, like, because of, like, you know, the sexual abuse and all the things that was experienced by folks who were unfortunately forced into those institutions, that's going to make their healing process and their connection process to sexuality as a positive thing a lot more complicated than what I have. And so, you know, like, I never disclosed doing that, you know, being a dancer and all that within that circle, because I just, through, like, things that I had heard other people say and talk about, like, oh, you know, you have to cover up, or you have to do this, or you have to do that. I just never really felt like it was a safe place for me to talk about that, which was sad, because, to be honest, I felt like I was living a double life a lot of the times. And it sucks, because, like, I come to these places to heal and to find myself, and to feel like I have to censor a huge part of who I am, was really hard for me to deal with. So, yeah, like, I kind of battled back and forth between, like, oh gosh, like, how do I connect these two pieces? It's just so, like, you know, I just kind of felt like there was perpetually this sense of conflict within myself. And so that's when I found out, a friend of mine, I think she was Secwepemc, which is a nation in the interior, around, like, Kamloops, I believe. I mean, the territory expands, like, past there, but that's where my friend was from. So anyways, she had told me, like, I remember seeing her at a conference, I think this was 3 years ago or something, or 4 years ago maybe, and she said, oh my god, like, you know, and this was when I first started going to ceremony and kind of digging in and connecting with other Indigenous folks. And she told me, because she knew I was a dancer, and she asked me if I knew about Virago Nation, and I said no. She said, oh, you should check them out, they're an all Indigenous burlesque troupe, like, they're super cool, I think you would really like them. And so it wasn't until, I think, maybe a year later or something, that I decided, you know, and this was around the time where I started feeling a lot of like, sense of conflict within, like, my Indigenous identity and my sex work. And so I reached out to them, because I noticed that, like, they are doing that work to, you know, rematriating Indigenous sexuality and reframing it and reclaiming it as ours. And our connection to our bodies and whatnot. So I reached out, the first person I reached out to was Ruth. Ruth O'Dare, who's one of the founders. Of the group. And, you know, I reached out to her, and we kind of chatted back and forth online, and it was really affirming for me to be able to have those conversations without feeling like I constantly had to separate the two, because that's what I was experiencing before. It was like, oh, I could talk about sex work with other sex workers or other dancers, but then when I talk about, like, ceremony and culture, it's always with another group, and I was really craving some people who could understand both worlds.
Yeah, for sure.
As one, and find that intersection. And so, yeah, like, we connected and we became friends, and then, you know, fast forward to, I guess, last year, they invited me to perform in one of their shows at Transform Cabaret last year, and then like, this summer they invited me to join the group. So now I'm currently an official member, which has been really awesome.
That is just, super cool.
Yeah. But yeah, like, I guess I kind of veered off a little bit there.
No, that's okay. It's all related. It's all related. So
yeah, totally. But I guess kind of coming back to just, like, how my indigeneity affects my involvement in the sex and adult entertainment industry is that, you know, obviously, you know, as Indigenous people, like, we carry that intergenerational trauma, and which is a direct product of colonialism and the church. And, you know, the church, unfortunately, has inflicted this idea of shame around our sexuality, and that, you know, it's not something to, you know, pleasure, and these things are not something to be, like, encouraged to participate in. And so I think that it's, you know, and I guess what I was mentioning earlier too, specifically to people who are direct survivors, because I really believe in like trailblazing and going ahead and being very pro let's dismantle this toxic shit, but I also believe in being gentle with like our elders and stuff, because we carry that generational trauma, but we also don't fully understand what it's like to live through that directly. And so I think it's a conversation that needs to be nuanced, and we need to take into consideration, you know, the experiences that everyone has within that. But I think that for me, like as a descendant of a residential school survivor, I feel like it's important to make sure that like I can connect with other people, and that we can start reframing that narrative and you know, saying that, yeah, like we don't have to be ashamed of our bodies, and this idea of like patriarchal ownership, and that, you know, our bodies and our sexuality is only something to be seen by like one man or
right.
like by
oh my god
partner. It's like, no, like actually I am my own person. This is my body. I can make my own rules, and I can choose to use it however I want, and that doesn't make me any less worthy than, you know, someone who chooses to be in a, you know, vanilla monogamous relationship, you know, or who chooses to cover up. And like I really believe that just like live and let live. You know, I'm not hurting anybody. I'm living my best life. You might not agree with me, and that's fine.
That's okay,
but, like,
though.
don't come at me with that sense of moral superiority.
Oh my gosh, I hate
bullshit.
that. It's total bullshit. I hate it so much.
Like, I feel, you know, I think like every sex worker or like adult entertainer feels that, you know, from society. Like, you know, we're seen as below, like, you know, bottom of the food chain or whatever you want to call it. But I think it's so not true. Like, we're, you know, sex workers and strippers and people that so many people that I've met who work in the industry are some of the most caring, loving, and loyal people that I've ever met in my life. And there's this like fierce sense of love that I feel towards like my peers in the community that I have not found anywhere else. Totally. And I think that like a lot of that comes from being marginalized by society. And it's like, you know, not to say that it's always like that, because, you know, we definitely got some beef in the community, like any community does, but like I really think it's important for us to stick with one another and have each other's backs and fight, you know, for the whole group of sex workers. And that's where I think intersectionality comes in as something that's really important when we start talking about politics regarding sex work. And, you know, there's this term, I don't know who coined it, and if we can even trace it back to one person. Okay. But the term hierarchy or hierarchy, and it's like this idea that certain professions within the umbrella term of sex work are better than others. So one thing that I've seen a lot is, you know, strippers versus full service sex workers or sugar babies, and thinking that just because you don't have sex with your clients that you're better than others.
I keep hearing this
too.
And
that's just like, that drives me nuts. It's so gross, because it's like, first of all, bitch, you're not better just because you're not sucking dick or you're not fucking old, you know, licking old man balls. Like, you know, that doesn't make you any better. No. And, you know, and it's like, really, like, we have to think society, unfortunately, looks down on us, and like a lot of them will, just because stripping, for example, is like one of the more acceptable forms of sex work, like we can't let that get to our heads and start internalizing that and treating, you know, full service workers or sugar babies or porn stars or street level workers too. Like, we got to keep those are the most vulnerable ones, of course. And like, I believe that when we're fighting for like rights and justice and to be seen and to be treated with dignity and respect, that like we always have to keep the most marginalized people as part of the equation, and like, you know, not center ourselves as like the more privileged workers in the community, you know?
No, totally. I mean, I'm so glad you brought that up, because that was supposed to be on the agenda today, but I was like, oh my gosh, do we have time to like fit everything in? But thank you so much for bringing that up. I want to go back to, you mentioned, and correct me if I'm pronouncing this incorrectly, because I think I mispronounced it earlier before recording, but you also dance, you mentioned with Virago Nation. Is that correct? Nation. Okay, good. How has performing with them, because you were performing with them last year and obviously this year too, but like, how has your performances with them, how has that differed from, say, your past sex work or your other forms of sex work? Because you have the other layer
I'll
on
just,
top of
I
it.
guess, say, like, my experience, like, dancing with Virago Nation, I wouldn't categorize that as sex work. It's more, like, that burlesque and performance art. But it's definitely revolutionized my relationship. Like, like, being a part of Virago Nation has actualized my desire to have the intersection between my indigeneity and my sexuality meet. And so to be able to connect with other Indigenous femmes and Two-Spirit people who are, you know, either in that line of work or who are very much, like, on the front lines of, you know, fighting for sexual sovereignty and body liberation and empowerment through reclaiming our sexualities, having a group and a troupe of, like, women and femmes that I can do that with has been, like, it's been an incredibly healing experience. It's very validating.
Great.
To like, because I felt so alone for a long time. And I just was like, am I ever, like, I knew, like, it would be a stupid thing to assume that I'm the only person who, like, lived that. But I just remember having this deep sense of yearning of, like, where are my people? Like, where are the Indigenous sluts at? Like, I need to find them, you know? And so, yeah, I just, it's been really awesome, like, connecting with them and having that sense of community. And we're a performance group and we share our craft and our burlesque and our dancing, but before anything else, we are a support group to one another. And it's just been amazing to have that sense of sisterhood with each member and not feel so alone within my own musings and feel seen and have people that we can, like, kind of use each other as a sounding board to talk about our own experiences and our own unique experiences about, you know, the shame and the complicated sexuality and the relationship that Indigenous people have with their sexualities. Wow.
I'm really just so glad that you're able to find that group, because I can feel your yearning for your identities to come meet together. And totally. I could hear that in your voice. I'm like, wow, I'm so glad that it was able to work out. So it's a beautiful story.
It was definitely, like, a big lifesaver in a lot of ways. Not to be all, like, dramatic, but, like, it is kind of true.
I guess the last part there that I wanted to kind of touch on in terms of dancing and kind of marrying your culture and that whole performanceship. How do you or can you incorporate culture into performance without appropriating?
Well, I think, like, if you're non-Indigenous, I think I would, like, kind of stray away from that. Like,
totally.
If this is referring to, like, other folks, because there's definitely been a lot of people who, you know, perhaps were well-meaning and were trying to create performance to, like, honor, you know, Indigenous people. But I think that if someone's going to go out and do that, like, you need to, you know, reach out to Indigenous people and ask them, is this a good way to honor?
For sure.
This, you know, but I guess if you're asking me specifically, definitely, like, there's, like, I guess one of the group numbers, and this was before I joined Virago Nation, but one of their numbers that they did was, I forget what the name of it was, like a powwow, a go-go, and it was they did it to Redbone, Come and Get Your Love, which is, like, such an iconic song for Indigenous people. Which, and it's like I consider it sort of like a mainstream old school song, where it's Come and Get Your Love. That song.
Okay.
If you don't know it, you should go listen to it. But yeah, so they did a number and they were dancing in, I've only seen it like once, like half of the performance. So I think that they were dancing in like fancy shawl powwow formation. So that's a whole other conversation itself. But powwows are like a celebration that happen kind of all across what's known today as North America. But it's a place where, you know, we celebrate culture and people dance. And, you know, there's different categories of dance for, like, women and men. And I'm not a powwow dancer myself. I've been wanting to get into it, but it's a process. You know, that's a whole other thing. But yeah, the main categories that I know of are jingle dress, fancy shawl, and traditional. Okay. And so I think from what I recall, I'm pretty sure they were dancing the fancy shawl steps, but wearing like 60s kind of like go-go dancing costume.
Oh, interesting.
So that's definitely a way that you can incorporate it.
Right.
But yeah, I'm not sure what the creation process of that act was like.
Right.
Because I said, I wasn't a part of Virago Nation back then. But I think that, if I were to go forward myself with trying to create a number that was incorporating that into my act, that the first and foremost would be about, okay, talking to my people, talking to my teachers, and asking my elders and people, what's the best way that I can represent this,
right,
in a way that's good, and also understanding that culture is something that is ever changing through time, and that evolves and it changes as people grow and old paradigms start to shift and whatnot.
Yeah, for sure.
So yeah, I don't know if that really answered your question.
No, it does. I guess with that we can actually go into some real Q&A.
Yeah.
And the first question comes from me because I actually forgot to ask you in the beginning of the show too, because we didn't get to talk about responsible dominance. So I thought I'd bring it up now. So because I know you did a workshop with Blackson, and
I love them. Yeah,
yes,
they're amazing. That's another resource actually for listeners who are into kink or who are interested in kink. I would highly recommend checking out Blackson on Instagram.
All right.
I think it's at SinBlack or Blackson, their Instagram handle.
I'll plug it.
I'll plug it. But they are a kink educator, a pornographer, and so if you're looking for some new smut to rub around to, or they have an OnlyFans and probably other sites that I might not know of, but they do teach workshops, which I've learned so much just from some of the reading that I've seen them write, and the virtual classes and workshops that I've taken with them. But yeah, I guess it's been helpful for me, especially because I have worked as a dominatrix over the years. Like I said, it's been more of a thing on the side. It's not my full-time job, but I have entertained some submissives over the last couple years, which has been a really... I enjoy being in that role. Yeah. But learning how to do so ethically, it has been obviously a monumental and very important thing for me to do, to make sure that I'm, being safe with my practice.
Yeah, of course.
But yeah, I guess responsible dominance, I mean, for anyone who's interested in exploring consensual power exchange within sexual or even in a non-sexual context, because BDSM and the dom and sub relationship doesn't always have to involve sex,
right?
But I would say obviously consent always first. Especially if you're newer to this, I would recommend kind of seeing if you can dive into some resources Blackson and finding other educators online, so you can learn more about the different kinks that are out there, and
so many
obviously
out there.
You might not know all the things that you're into right away. I've learned for sure having that kind of consensual power exchange and being a submissive has something that's always been interesting, but there's been so many new things that I've learned about myself and new kinks that I've discovered I was into as I grew deeper into my practice, whether it be shibari or rope bondage or, knife play or, there's so many things that, we can be into. So to just, knowledge is power. So educating ourselves as much as possible. And also if you're playing, with someone, or you're going to choose to exchange or to engage in a kinky relationship with someone, to always be really clear about what your needs are and what you're looking out of the experience. definitely being informed by trauma is very important.
Okay.
So like, you know,
What do you mean by that?
I'll talk a little bit about one of my experiences,
Sure.
that I had. So I had a partner of mine, who, you know, we engaged in we did a lot of kinky shit together. We had a lot of kinky sex together. And, you know, I like getting choked out consensually.
Yeah, it's great. When done properly.
Yeah, properly. And so, you know, we had obviously an agreement. It was like, okay, well, listen, I like being choked out, but I'm going to tell you once I tap on your wrist, first of all, don't choke me out if my hands are like bound, or like at least figuring out like a nonverbal communication if that was the case, so you can know when to let go. Yeah. But I would tap on his arm, and there was multiple times where he would not let go and keep choking me, and it happened a couple times actually where I lost consciousness and I passed out, and I woke up and I had no idea where it was. What happened? Yeah. Oh my god, so that scary. Was like really fucked up and really scary. Yeah. And yeah, so like, you know, for example, because I've had those experiences, like I still enjoy getting choked out today, but I don't ever do it with someone without having proper conversation. Right. And I would encourage people, like, don't wait for something bad to happen to have that conversation. Like, it's really, you know, BDSM is like, there's always going to be risk in anything that you do, but it's about reducing risk and like seeing what's the safest way that you can go about this. And so, you know, for me, coming from my own personal experiences, if I'm going to be engaging in power exchange with someone and, you know, be disclosing, okay, this is what I want to do. I want to do some rope play. I want, you know, like choke me out or whatever. And to be able to explain to this person, like, listen, I have trauma around like erotic asphyxiation. So I need you to like handle this with care and with love, and know that, like, you know, when I tell you to let go, you let go. Like, this is not a game of you holding on for an extra couple seconds. Like, you gotta stop when I stop, because like people, you can die from that kind of shit. Like, it's not, you know, it's all fun and games, but like there's very serious risk associated to a lot of practices within the world of BDSM. So that's why I think, like, educate. Like,
as much as you can.
You can never be, you know, it's an ongoing process. And I think, people should not think that, you know, they're so knowledgeable on so many things that they can just stop learning. Like, there's always going to be new takes out there.
Yeah, absolutely.
So being trauma-informed, consent, negotiating always before playing with someone, and like, you know, I'm going to quote Blackson again. Okay. This is going to be my last point on this. But yeah, so there was, in one of the workshop on responsible dominance that I did with him, he said something which I really, really, really resonated with. And he said, view dominance as something, they said, pardon, I misgendered them.
That's okay.
They said, view dominance as something that you can call upon and not who you are, which I think a lot of people get into kink and BDSM and power exchange without really realizing that, like, you have to be doing that from a place of love and empathy. Yes. And a lot of, like, you know, especially if we're looking at like heterosexual relationships, and specifically like, you know, between like a cisgendered man and a woman, like I've had so many experiences, like, you know, when I've dated certain men that, you know, we would be more rough with each other, where like I could feel like that was like coming from a place of misogyny, which is really icky. And I think that a lot of people who think that they're dominants or view themselves as dominants are like, oh yeah, I'm kinky. It's like, well, no, you're not kinky. You're just an asshole who's using your own misogyny and disguising it as being into kink. Because real kink and real BDSM, like, especially if you're being a dominant, like, you gotta fucking watch yourself. Like, you gotta check yourself always and like really evaluate, like, why are you doing this? Yes. Where is this coming from? Are you going to be keeping the best interest, like your submissive's best interest at heart with every action? Are you going to listen to them when they tell you that, you know, maybe something you did was too much? How are you going to correct that? You know?
Yeah, like, totally.
It's really, like, at the end of the day, I think it comes down to accountability, respect, and, you know, always being open to feedback and criticism, because you know,
sure.
we're not perfect. We're gonna make mistakes, but I think that the real thing that's gonna demonstrate our good character is how we deal with those mistakes and how we utilize those experiences as a way to grow and move forward and, you know, keep bettering ourselves as human beings and as kinky people.
Well said. I'm so glad I got to bring that up before I let you go. So I was like, But there's just a couple more questions here as well. So this person writes in, what myths or stereotypes are you sick and tired of hearing?
Of I guess about sex work.
Yeah, they didn't specify, so it's really up to you how you take the question.
I'm really tired of the narrative around you were forced into this, or you have daddy issues, or you must have a drug addiction. And I just those
they're so old.
Yeah, it's so
my God.
Old. It's I'm real sick of it. Because
Gets
I actually
tiresome.
have a fucking great relationship with my dad. He knows I dance, and he's you know, when I first told him, it wasn't, you know, we didn't talk for 5 months or whatever, but he totally turned around, and my brother and my cousin, you know, knew that what I was doing and saw that, you know, I have a good head on my shoulders.
Yeah.
I'm fine, you know, and I think the main concern was safety for him, but you know, he totally came around, and now he's asked me questions about you know, what's it like to work a night at the club and whatnot, and so that's it's really brought us closer, which is awesome. I love being able to just tell him, you know, about you know, there'd be times that he'd come and visit me from Montreal, and I'd you know, we'd be having dinner at my house, and I'd go to work after, and he was like, "Wow, your makeup looks so nice. Have a good night. Good luck."
That's awesome. That's so great to hear. So supportive.
Yeah, totally. There's
wonderful.
You know, Nikki Ninedoors. I mean, not to speak on her experience, but you know, when she would do the retro strip show,
yes,
you know, her parents would come and they would have a booth, and they were so excited about it. It was super cute.
So awesome. Oh my gosh, I love it.
Yeah, totally. So that's definitely one. It's you know, the conflation of sex trafficking and consenting sex worker
for
between
sure.
two consenting adults is very annoying, and I just wish that more people understood that those are two different things completely.
Yes. Yeah, it's really dangerous to, and we've talked about this in the podcast quite a bit, but it's really dangerous to combine those two together and put them under the same umbrella. So
yeah, it's dangerous to both sex workers and to actual victims of trafficking.
Exactly. Oh my God.
Yeah.
Very frustrating.
Yeah, totally.
And I guess the last question here is, what's the best way to educate ourselves about Indigenous justice?
Well, I'm not sure where this person was based out of, but I'll just give a couple resources here for people who are based in Canada.
Sure.
So first of all, I would recommend reading the inquiry report for missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people. Indigenous women are far more likely to experience, I don't remember all the statistics and the numbers by heart for everything, but we're something 5 times more likely to get, you know, experience violence, get murdered earlier on in our lives.
Right.
And whatnot. So reading the inquiry report these are links and documents that I can personally send you if you wanted to include them in the description.
Yeah, for sure.
Reading that, read the Indian Act. This is something, especially for people in Canada. Yes. This is a legal document that the whole goal of it was basically asserting control over the rights of Indigenous people and how the land and the resources and everything was used.
Right.
So reading the Indian Act, those are both lengthy reads, but necessary if you're living on these lands.
Yeah.
And just listening to Indigenous people, of course, you know, we're not a monolith. No person can speak for all of Indigenous people together. No. So keeping your perspectives diverse and really trying to focus on grassroots people who are actually on the front lines and not necessarily nonprofit, governmental organizations and stuff. The real important work is, you know, people who are in the streets and disrupting the systems and, and, you know, doing that. So yeah, trying to educate yourself, on those, there's definitely more resources I feel like I can throw in there. You know, I guess the battle between the Wet'suwet'en Nation and Coastal GasLink is one of them. So at Wet'suwet'en Checkpoint is a good page to follow on Instagram.
Awesome.
I can link you to that too, as well as Tiny House Warriors. They're battling against the TMX pipeline. But yeah, all those like folks who are like really like kind of living on their lands and fighting against reckless resource extraction.
Mm-hmm. Wow, there's gonna be a lot of links in this episode. If you guys haven't checked the links already,
so many topics.
It's a lot. I'm surprised we even got through like pretty much all of them.
It's been like just a little over an hour.
I'm impressed. We got to stay on track too.
Me too.
But before I let you go, Lynx, where can we find you?
My Instagram is at Alaylay, so AYLAYLAY_. I am currently shadow banned, unfortunately. Classic. So if you start searching me in like the search bar, you'll have to type in my whole handle in order for it to come up. You can also try typing Lynx Chase, because that's like the name in my, like, not my handle, but the, like, you know, whatever
in
the bio part.
Yeah.
But again, you'd have to probably type the whole thing in because I'm shadow banned. And my OnlyFans too, so onlyfans.com/LynxChase. That's where I put all my non-censored content up. So if you're looking for some smut, definitely subscribe.
Excellent. I am so glad and honored for you to be on the show today and to spread all this wonderful education and all the resources and knowledge that you have.
Thank you.
On this topic. So
thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Thank you. And don't forget, new episodes every Sunday is Strip by Sia or my personal Sia Steph. And we'll catch you guys in for another episode next week. Bye. You're listening to Strip by Sia, hosted, produced, and edited by Steph Sia, artwork by Maria Bellandarama, music by Ted D, and photography by Ian Daburn.